rely on published reviews where possible. And for some of these topics, there's some really well done, credible reviews already, so no need for us to redo that work. Okay, a few notes about the evidence. Some of the evidence is indirect rather than direct, by which I mean that the studies report on outcomes other than VMT. And this is true, especially, for example, with the transit-related measures, where the studies are almost always looking at what are the impacts on transit ridership rather than what are the impacts on VMT. Now, anything that's going to increase transit ridership, in all likelihood, is reducing VMT to some degree, but the translation is not necessarily one for one. So if we want to use that evidence to estimate the reductions in VMT, we have to make some additional assumptions to make that conversion. And then another thing I really want to emphasize here is that, and it turns out this is a Carl Sagan quote, I didn't know that, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So as you will see on the next slide, for some of these potential mitigation measures, there really is just not a lot of empirical evidence out there. That doesn't mean that those are not good mitigation measures. It simply means we don't have a lot of good evidence yet in hand. And that can make it very difficult to estimate and quantify the effects of those measures. But it doesn't mean those measures shouldn't be considered and shouldn't be done. And why there is some absence of evidence. Some measures are just harder to study than others. Some of the measures we were looking at are simply too new for very much research to have been done yet. And then, some other measures just have not been a hot topic for researchers. Some topics, there's oodles of stuff because the researchers get excited about it and they produce all these studies. But there are other potentially important strategies that just haven't gotten that kind of attention. So keep that in mind. Now, what I'm going to show you first are our summaries of sort of what's the state of the evidence in terms of whether it's direct or indirect, and its relative strength. Is it weak, moderate, or strong? And then, of course, what is it pointing to? And usually that is a reduction in VMT, or at least a potential reduction in VMT. And so we'll go through that first, and then do a quick pause, and then talk about the second part is our recommendations on quantification, where we look at the various options that are out there. We cover 42 topics, so I'm not going to talk in detail about any of these. We've got, I think, 6 different categories, so we'll have a slide per category. Save questions for later. How much we can get into the weeds here. We just don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot to be covered. And of course, the weeds, the detail is going to all be available in our reports, but at least this gives you an idea of what we covered and the kinds of things we were finding. So first category, public transportation measures. And I think the overall picture here is that most of this evidence is indirect, as I've already said. The studies look at what are the impacts on transit ridership rather than VMT directly. And then for a couple of these topics, there's lots of research. Transit service headways and frequency and transit fares have been studied a lot. Other specific things, not so much. So we've got moderate evidence on some other things, and then weak evidence in a few cases, and some new ideas that we just didn't turn up any really solid evidence on, like mobility hubs and marketing of transit. Travel demand management measures. Here we didn't find a lot of strong evidence. Again, sometimes the evidence is indirect. And of course, this is a lot focused on peak hour trip reduction. Or these measures have traditionally been focused on peak hour trip reduction rather than total VMT reduction. So the studies don't always tell us what it is we would like to know. Third category is land use measures. Yeah, here on some of these, we've got, again, lots of research. Of course, that doesn't mean that it necessarily shows what we're hoping it will show. Residential density comes out as very strong. Land use mix comes out as very strong. Other measures here are a little more, well, moderate or even weak and inconclusive sort of evidence. Road management measures, again, it's mixed, strong evidence on congestion pricing and local network connectivity, some moderate indirect evidence on road diets and complete streets. Traffic calming and curb management, again, if we're talking about VMT reduction as opposed to other kinds of outcomes, we weren't able to find anything really there. Jamey.
All right, so active transportation measures. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence on the efficacy of bicycle facilities, and as Susan mentioned, I mean, a lot of this is showing an indirect effect. So there's a huge amount of facility level studies, before and after empirical studies, that show substantial increase in bicycle ridership on a corridor after the addition of a bicycle facility, and that includes all the way down from class 3 bicycle boulevards to up through class 1 off-street bicycle paths. So across the board of your main bicycle facilities, there's a strong indirect effect on ridership, and then there's also strong evidence of modal substitution. So combined, you get more people bicycling, and about 10% of those new, or 10% of the bicyclists are actually substituting for auto trips. So pretty clear evidence there. Pedestrian facilities, there's much less evidence, but there is still evidence of an effect. Some of it is kind of the same indirect evidence that we have with the bicycle facilities, although there's a lot fewer studies there. And then there are some actual studies that try to quantify the actual direct VMT impacts, and that's and they show a reduction in VMT. Pedestrian amenities, so this would be things like adding street trees or adding benches. That's very, very difficult to tease out any impact from something kind of that minor. And so basically there's almost no evidence on there that would be able to allow you to quantify an effect of doing these kind of minor street modifications to make things more comfortable for pedestrians. The theory would suggest that they do have some kind of effect on increasing walking, but the effect is there's just not enough evidence to really quantify that. E-bike incentive programs, and so here we didn't look at the effect of like a particular amount of incentive or particular type of incentive. We just looked at the evidence of the e-bike owners. How many trips do they take? Do they substitute for auto trips when they take their e-bikes? What are their average e-bike trip lengths? There's not a lot of empirical evidence there, but some very good studies have come out recently that do actually quantify the reductions in VMT, and they show a pretty sizable reduction. They show that actually, like e-bikes, they are substituting for longer auto trips than you might expect with traditional bikes, which makes sense. And And then bike share and scooter share, there's actually a lot of information there on the indirect level, which makes sense because you have a lot of these operators, businesses who want to collect data to understand how well their business is doing and inform future investment decisions. And so we have a lot of information about average trip lengths, and they have also proprietary information which you would use if you're estimating the effect of any particular new program that you're considering. They would have some proprietary information about how many trips you could expect from that kind of program. So we didn't look into how many trips you would expect. That is something that I would expect as you're fleshing out a business plan for a bike share or scooter share program. You would have a good estimate of that as the business. So yeah, a lot of good information on trip lengths and on also substitution as well. And that, just like with bicycle facilities and most of this active travel, comes from surveys of users, after the fact, or even mid-trip, just intercept surveys asking how you would have taken that trip if you weren't doing it on bike share or scooter share. And so there's very strong both direct and indirect evidence of VMT reductions there. And again, just like with bicycle facilities, there's actually, and pedestrian facilities, a pretty clear method for quantifying, which we'll get into in the next section. Parking. So we'll break this down further in terms of the different type of parking pricing and parking restriction mechanisms or policies that you can have. But just in general, parking pricing measures do have a strong indirect effect on VMT, quite strong, and in reducing VMT, especially workplace parking pricing. Parking restrictions also show kind of a moderate, both direct and indirect. The evidence is a little less fleshed out there, and it's harder to kind of specify the effect for different types of policies. But there is a pretty good evidence that, say, if you cap parking per dwelling unit, for example, at 1 unit or less per dwelling unit, you'll get a decent VMT reduction as compared to the average VMT for the average dwelling unit of the same type that has the average number of parking spaces.
All right, and then the second half of what we did was to think about what are the options for quantifying the effects of all of those measures. So there are basically two different kinds of approaches, and then for the second one, there's some different options. So obviously, travel demand forecasting models can be used for some of these measures, but a lot of the measures are simply not representable in the models. You can't, most of them don't incorporate bicycle and pedestrian facilities, for example, in a way that you could use them to test the effects of proposed mitigation measures. So that, of course, is where elasticity-based methods can be helpful. So out of this empirical research, we can extract elasticities or other versions of an effect size that says, if you do this amount of a measure, you can expect to see this amount of an effect on VMT. And there are different sources we can draw from to pick what's the right elasticity or effect size. So there's the work we just presented to you, where we went through our own review of the empirical evidence and looked for not just is there evidence, but is there a quantification of the effect. There are the CARB SB 375 research briefs that I've already mentioned. And as I said, these are being updated. So so far we are citing some of the old ones, but also some of the new ones, because we were working on some of the new ones as well. So there will be a little bit of updating of the current version of our report once those are officially approved. And then those two things should match pretty closely. And then the other source is the CAPCOA handbook, which I assume most of you out there have some familiarity with. So this is CAPCOA's methods for estimating GHG emission reductions. That is focused on development projects. So a developer comes in, is proposing a big project. They want credits for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for incorporating certain features into those projects, or paying for certain kinds of mitigations. So there's a lot of really useful information in there, but the methods are not, in many cases, directly usable for what we're focused on here, in that it's all about VMT reductions for a project relative to what the VMT emissions would have been. So the actual calculations that they lay out in the handbook are mostly not usable here, but some of the assumptions they make in there can be helpful. And for many of these measures, they have elasticities that they're assuming that may draw on the CARB briefs, or they may have found an elasticity from some other source. So in any event, a lot of overlap between these three sources, but not in a perfect alignment, either of what measures are covered or what elasticities are settled on or proposed in those different sources. Some caveats about this. Like I said, the evidence is indirect for many measures, which means you have to make some additional assumptions to go from whatever the elasticity is that we have, and translating that into a reduction in VMT rather than a reduction in, or an increase in transit ridership, or an increase in bicycling and all of that. So that's something we lay out in our report, is how, what sort of steps you would need to take to make that conversion, and what sources you might use to make those assumptions. I think it's important to remember that most of the evidence is pre-COVID. So big assumption that that all of this evidence and the effect sizes from that evidence still apply in the post-COVID world. For some measures, that's probably not a problem at all. For others, it gets a little complicated. Telecommuting, for example, is a very different thing now than it was 5 or 6 years ago. Another thing to keep in mind is that, of course, in mitigating for these highway projects, there's usually a package of these measures, and that can change the effects. Sometimes there are synergies. So if you do a bunch of things together, you get more than the sum of the parts. But there can also be sort of limits or thresholds where the marginal benefit of adding another measure is maybe not going to make so much of a difference. And that's something that the CAPCOA method takes into account. They cap the total reductions in VMT that any project could get, with more measures added. A couple of other maybe sort of subtle things also to keep in mind is that, this research is done on these measures independent of what's happening to the highway system. So in this case, we're talking about mitigation measures while there is a highway widening happening in the nearby area. And the point here is that a highway widening will tend to reduce the effectiveness of the measures to some degree, right? Because at the same time you're making transit better and making walking and biking better, you're also making driving better. So that that reduces the incentive to use those other modes. So that could be more or less of an issue for different measures and depending on the particular context. There is also the backfilling issue. Jamey, do you want to talk about that one?
Sure. And that's not an issue with every measure, but the concern here is that if you are reducing VMT to such an extent that it reduces congestion, makes it noticeably easier to drive on the affected corridor, then that can induce travel in the same way, or induce vehicle travel in the same way that expanding that facility might do. And so that's just an issue. We don't have a great quantification of this, and for a lot of the measures, and for certain measures, you probably wouldn't expect that the reduction in vehicle traffic on the affected roadways would have such an effect that it would incentivize additional driving to get back up to the levels it was before, and offset the VMT reductions of the measure. But it's something to be concerned about, or just be aware of. And so, yeah, again, we don't have a good quantification there, but it's just something to be aware of.
And of course, all this means there's a very high degree of uncertainty in any of this quantification. There's uncertainty inherent in the empirical evidence we're looking at to extract those elasticities, and then all these other points we've just made. So again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We have a lot of different topics, and what these summary slides show is kind of what the options are available for each of the different topics. And then in the report, we also include a recommendation where we, you know, if we think the travel demand model makes sense, we explain under which conditions we think that could make sense. And then if we think the elasticity method makes sense, then we recommend an elasticity that could be used and discuss the various steps you'd have to go through to actually do the calculation. And, you know, with all of these, part of what's tricky is thinking about kind of the scale at which they're applied and the area, the VMT area, which is going to be affected by all of this. But all of that sort of detail is spelled out in the second of our reports. And you'll see in, well, in some cases, our recommendation ends up being do not quantify, that we do not see a clear basis for how you would quantify the effect of that measure based on the empirical evidence. And again, that doesn't mean it's not a good mitigation measure. It's just that there isn't, again, a clear basis for how you would quantify that. So I think you've had a chance to look at these. And then we've got the demand management measures, which looks a little better in terms of having some basis for doing some quantification. In some cases, the CAPCOA method and the CARB briefs report a, they report on some effect sizes, but in our own review, for various reasons, we've decided that we don't think that evidence is strong enough to be able to do a quantification. And then land use measures, of course, you know, many of these can be, some of these can be, yeah, most of them can be estimated with a travel demand model if you adjust those land use assumptions. But elasticity measures also possible for many of these. And road management measures. And active transportation. Jamey, anything to add here?
No, not much. I think Yeah, there was this is probably where we had the most kind of disagreement with the CAPCOA method, so that's spelled out in the report as well. But there are yeah, ample evidence here to use an elasticity based quantification for almost all of these except for pedestrian amenities.
And I will just point out that Jamey developed, I think, some really sound methods for bicycle and pedestrian facilities for a car project we did several years ago now. And I think that's what you're recommending, right, Jamey? Yeah.
Yeah, recommending that
Yeah.
for the bicycle facilities. Yeah, for sure. And a similar approach for the pedestrian facilities could be used.
Mhm. And then parking management, which gets complicated because there are lots of versions here.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is what I was saying earlier. There's just a ton of different types of parking pricing programs and parking restrictions options. And so um, especially for the parking pricing, there's a very substantial empirical evidence about pricing, especially at workplace. There's some evidence about cash out programs, although that's limited in terms of the number of studies. But there's a pretty clear elasticity. Same with on-street parking pricing. So not just at the workplace, but just on the street. And these are primarily studies done in urban areas. So that's one caveat that this might not apply in more rural or more suburban areas. But especially for urban areas, there's pretty good evidence for most of this. One thing I will point out here is that travel demand models they do incorporate some elements of parking. The issue is a lot of them do not incorporate enough granularity, either about a specific program or in all the levels of the travel demand, all the steps of the travel demand model, that it won't fully capture this, or at least it won't be able to estimate the effect of a specific policy. Say, like, you know, often you might be considering pricing parking at one business. I mean, that's not something that really is too granular for a travel demand model to look at. And so the caveat here is we didn't put an X in the travel demand model. Travel demand models can do some parking analysis, but just not really specific enough in most cases to give you a good estimate. So there is a good amount of evidence to do an elasticity based approach.
Yeah. So that's an overview of a whole lot of work. And as I said, there will be reports coming out, probably the quantification report with an appendix on our review of the literature. Caltrans is currently reviewing our quantification report, and I'm sure they'll be anxious to get it out there once they've had a chance to go through it. So we have a few minutes for questions before I'm going to turn it over to Chris. And it looks like, are we getting them through chat?
Yeah, some through chat, and then you can raise your hand as well. So
Yeah, so just following up on the question about congestion pricing, yes, that's what we looked at. Of course, New York hasn't done it, so there is no empirical evidence on it. I should note that we did focus on empirical evidence, meaning things that have actually happened in the world that people have collected data about, as opposed to simulation studies. A lot of these topics, there's more evidence from simulation studies than actual empirical evidence. Our focus was that empirical evidence. What has actually been observed out there in the world?
looks like we have one hand raised. Sunny, you still have a question?
Sorry, no, I did that by mistake.
Oh, okay. And then let's see, Mugs.
I didn't raise my hand, Jamie, sorry.
Oh, just another, yes.
Zoom does that to me sometimes. I'm raising my hand
Yes.
all the time.
Well, maybe third time's the charm. Matt?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Matt Baker with PCL. Thanks for this. I'm sorry I missed the slide. You went through it quickly. What was your finding on quantifiability of mix of uses?
Well, let's say I can go back or just tell you that, yeah, there's good, strong evidence about, mixed use development, and there are ways to quantify it. I think the issue for mixed use development is the implementation, right? How would you make that happen as a mitigation measure? But yeah, there's good evidence out there about the importance of mixed use development. And of course, lots of synergies between mixed use development and a lot of the other mitigation measures. I see a couple questions in chat. Hope the quantification report is released. When it's released, can be circulated to attendees. That'll be a Caltrans decision, but I'm sure it's going to be widely available for use for anybody working on this stuff. There was a question from Daryl about, will the report include numbers such as estimated elasticities? Yes, that'll be a part of our recommendations, with, again, the caveat that there's lots of uncertainty. So, we can recommend an effect size to use as kind of middle ground based on the range of things that we see in the evidence. Oh, Jamie answered that one.
And then there's another question from Allison about how we would go about quantifying the effect of VMT reduction measures for projects. And that's, we don't have enough time in the webinar to go through the recommended quantification methods for all these 42 measures, but that is going to be included or it is included in the quantification piece of our report. And so basically we're saying, is there enough evidence to use an elasticity method? If so, what elasticity to use? And if not, what do we recommend? Just use a travel demand model, something else. Let's see, there's another question. Are there any measures you found to be understudied but have a high potential for VMT mitigation? That's a great question. And I think one of the ones that's been understudied, but there's increasingly very good empirical work on it is e-bikes. Obviously, e-bikes haven't been around for a very long, for that long, in terms of at least where they have a cost point or enough incentives to make them more widely available. And so we're getting a lot more empirical evidence there, but so far there hasn't been a lot. But what we have seen points to some sizable VMT reductions. I would also say cash out programs. So there is not a lot of empirical parking cash out programs, not a lot of empirical work done. I mean, there's one seminal study by Don Shoup that we cite, but that's, decades old at this point. But my guess, based on the evidence we have around parking pricing generally, that it has a high potential for VMT mitigation, but could be studied some more. I don't know, Susan, there's probably some others that
yeah, well, I think of the ones I looked at, this issue of synergy is something we really need a better handle on. And then the other one that comes to mind is telecommuting, because it has changed so much, in that so many more of us are doing it. So it's no longer just, early adopters or people living especially far from work. So for example, when I telecommute, I'm not saving any VMT because I'd be biking 2 miles to campus. So we've got a very different population of telecommuters now that really changes the VMT impacts. And then of course, there's the whole question about, with remote work, are people choosing to live farther away from work? And all of that is still playing out, and there is some research going on now, but I think that's going to be a really important issue in the next couple of years. And then, as companies start to change their policies, and the state, for example, is demanding that people go back to the office. It'll be a while before all that settles down. Okay, with that, we're going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to go through his work, and then there should be some additional time we can stay on and answer further questions.
All right. I'm going to assume everything is showing up well, unless I hear otherwise. So I'm going to talk real briefly about this parallel effort that was going on during the project to look at the potential use of accessibility analysis in evaluating VMT mitigation. I'll explain what accessibility analysis is exactly if folks don't know in a second. But it's a concept that's been, a lot of interest in for a while, and with pretty primitive measures over the years. But now there's new tools and platforms and data available that's making accessibility analysis actually being put to use in agencies, including Caltrans. So there was an interest in figuring out if this was another tool in the toolkit and looking at VMT. So accessibility analysis is basically the ease of reaching destinations. We, for this study, landed on cumulative opportunity metrics, basically the cumulative opportunities within 60 minutes. That is how many jobs or points of interest you can reach within 60 minutes. And we also used we weighted destinations using a travel time decay function, which basically means if something's really close, it counts more. As it gets further away, it counts less. So we're not treating everything equal within that 60-minute radius. The way that these analyses were done, they can account for all kinds of factors that affect travel times to different destinations, including travel speeds, available routes, wait times for transit, and bike and walk conditions. And some of the tools, including some that Caltrans is using now, really can get into a pretty good level of detail in accounting for vehicle speeds, transit routes and schedules and speeds, and walk and bike conditions. We landed on, we looked at a bunch of different metrics, ultimately landed on some regional metrics, access to jobs by driving and transit. And you can see in the upper right here, we sort of surveyed different metrics that are out there. And you can see that a lot of those metrics are clustered in that top left. Regional measures, access to jobs by driving and transit. So we looked at those. And then for local metrics, if you look again at that image on the right there, a lot of clustering around people measuring local access in terms of access to points of interest by walking and biking. So again, we looked at all kinds of metrics, but ultimately landed on that sort of regional and local breakdown. For this study, the available data is sort of a shortcoming, a challenge, especially when it comes to VMT data. And that's true for a lot of the VMT studies that Susan and Jamey looked at too. But we dug up all the different VMT sources that we could find for California and looked at them for the study. At the household level, we used the National Household Travel Survey. And then we also used data at the block group level from a number of sources, one of which was Latch. And that's a data product that is derived from the National Household Travel Survey using some modeling. So that comes with some limitations. Data from CARB. This was data that was compiled by folks at UCLA from vehicle odometer readings. And then data from Replica, which is a commercial product that is basically a big travel demand model. The CARB and Replica data we actually got our hands on pretty late in the game during the study, so didn't really get to spend a lot of time assessing the inner workings and quality of those data, but we did include them in the study. And then for accessibility data, you'll notice all the household VMT data is pre-COVID. So we wanted to make sure that our accessibility data was also pre-COVID. So for access to jobs by driving in transit, we use data from the Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota. They put out an Access Across America report every few years. And those were from 2018 and 2019 in order to match the VMT data. And then for walking and biking, we did leverage the Conveyo platform that Caltrans currently has access to. That has points of interest built in, which can actually be sort of challenging to get your hands on. It can be pretty expensive data, but it is built into Caltrans license. It's able to let us measure walking and biking access, account for level of traffic stress. So that was sort of a custom data set, the walking and biking to points of interest. I guess one other thing I'll mention here is, especially at the household level, there's a lot of variation in VMT. You know, any given household might drive more or less in the year for any number of reasons, going on long vacations and whatnot. So we were really looking at the consistency and direction of relationships, and knowing that none of these models would necessarily explain a whole lot of variation in household VMT. Our modeling framework. So we developed models using each of the different VMT data. And as I mentioned, what we were really looking for was consistency in the model coefficients. So even though we had different VMT data sets that were telling us something slightly different about household VMT, we were looking to see if when we ran models with each of those data sets, we were seeing consistent relationships among the different factors, which we did see, as you'll see in a minute. And we looked at various combinations of factors, including demographics, density, and accessibility metrics. We did have to treat some of the data sources different, as you can see on the right. The Latch data set, as I mentioned, is built from NHTS data using demographic information from the census. So, so those data are sort of simulated, which means we can't really account for demographic factors in our models. So we really just looked at built environment characteristics. That is housing density and accessibility. For the other data sources, we did account for demographics and built environment characteristics. And we did look at including vehicle ownership as an additional factor, but we leaned on some similar recent research that basically shows vehicle ownership is a byproduct of demographics and built environment characteristics. So we pulled it out of the modeling here. And the last thing to mention is there's a lot of challenges with collinearity and scale of the accessibility metrics in this work. So just thinking about accessibility metrics by different modes, center cities where there's a high concentration of jobs are going to have the best access to destinations by driving. They're also going to tend to have the best access by transit, walking, and biking. So those accessibility metrics all sort of increase in parallel more and less. So it's tricky to sort out the different effects of different modes. Scale was also a problem. You know, in most regions across the state, you'd be lucky if you could reach 100,000 jobs. In some of the larger regions, San Francisco, Los Angeles, that's a pretty low accessibility number. So we played with a bunch of different accessibility metrics to kind of correct for these, including looking at the percent of jobs in the region that you could reach by driving and access, and by looking at the ratio of transit access to driving access. And that helped us tease out some of those issues. So here are the results shown in elasticities, like Susan mentioned in the first half. The important things to note here, as we expected, demographic characteristics have a pretty strong influence on VMT, that is income household size. And then density, as we know from literature, as density increases, VMT decreases, and that's a pretty strong relationship too. When it comes to accessibility metrics, a really important finding is that the way we built these models, we actually saw that as access to jobs by driving increases, VMT also increases by a small amount. In contrast, when you increase access to jobs by transit or access to points of interest by walking and biking, you see a considerable decrease in VMT. And these elasticities here you can see range from 0.5 to around 0.1. And as you'll show, I'll show in a second, this is quite an improvement over research that's been done before. We did see some pretty low R-squared values, a lot of variation in household VMT, especially NHTS data, which is the household level, because as I mentioned, while these directional relationships are pretty strong, there's a lot of variation at the individual household level. So finally, just talking through some of the implications. As I mentioned, this approach was a vast improvement over earlier research. On the right here, you can see an earlier meta-analysis by Mark Stevens, which you'll see a couple things. First of all, access to jobs by driving has been shown to have a pretty strong negative impact on VMT. We looked at most of these studies. They often use pretty primitive accessibility metrics, sometimes just looking at straight line distance to destinations, and just other ways of measuring accessibility that we can do much better today. Also, one of the studies, for example, said, the relationship of driving access to VMT is pretty strong. Therefore, we can ignore all the other modes. We can get rid of transit access and walking and biking access, which, as I mentioned, there's a lot of complex interactions there. And those previous studies, there was only 3 of them, didn't really find a strong influence of transit accessibility. And like I said, that's because they use pretty primitive methods that they wouldn't have been able to use the tools that we use in this case. Promising use cases in terms of measuring VMT in a mitigation context. Definitely strong potential to measure major changes in transit service, that is adding transit service or adding frequency, new routes, increasing speeds. Those types of changes can be reflected using an accessibility measure. Also major changes to bike and pedestrian networks, probably not, project level changes, minor changes on individual routes. But as Jamey mentioned, there are some other tools that can already capture that pretty well. And then land use changes, I think great potential here because these types of tools could let us move beyond just looking at, density by itself or mixed use by itself, and actually looking at how specific land use changes in different places affect access to jobs and other opportunities by walking and biking and transit. And then biggest takeaway here probably is ripe opportunities for future research. I think this was a good sort of ground testing of the concepts and shows a lot of promise over what we've seen in earlier research. One of the things I didn't really mention explicitly is obviously the data is cross-sectional. It's a snapshot of a point in time. So we know that, someone over here drives less than someone over there, but we don't know from this whether changes in accessibility have an impact, a bigger impact over time, as other studies have shown. So I think with the right data, sort of time series data or whatever, there's a lot of potential to leverage accessibility much more. So I think I will leave it at that, and I'm sure there may be some questions. But that is my contact information, which I'll leave up for just a second. And I think hand things back to Susan and Jamey.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think now, we just have a good amount of time for Q&A. So unless Susan, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to emphasize Chris's final point about this being cross-sectional analysis, which is true of much of the empirical research for most of the strategies that we looked at. So it's looking at differences in one place versus another in terms of whatever the measure is and then whatever the VMT is. And that's not nearly as powerful as a study that looks at the change in VMT if you implement that measure. But there are just very few measures for which we have that kind of longitudinal, sort of experimental kind of evidence. And we need a lot more of it to really understand. And hopefully, as these measures get implemented, somebody's collecting the data so that we can see what the impacts are.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the nice benefits of some of the indirect research, whether it's on transit ridership or on active travel measures, is a lot of that is actually longitudinal, and you're looking at before and after changes. And so that isn't a direct measure of VMT, but if you have trustworthy information on modal substitution, then that can provide potentially a better estimation of VMT reduction than maybe some of the cross-sectional studies on VMT. All right, so I think open it up to questions. So you can, yeah, either raise your hand or we can do you can speak your question orally, or we can do, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A, monitoring all of those. So we have a question here. In the chat, any insights on how managed lanes would impact VMT? That isn't something we looked at in this study. The main reason being that adding a managed lane wouldn't be a VMT mitigation measure. Even if you're just converting a lane, a general purpose lane to managed lanes, I mean, the purpose often of managing the lane is to reduce congestion, increase throughput. So you could manage a lane to increase throughput, and that would probably increase VMT, unless you're pricing it, so high that not many people are going to use it. We have separate research that we have done that looks at this, and there's actually a recent report by Mike Manville at UCLA that looks at managed lanes, and he concluded what we've also found at our independent research at UC Davis and the limited empirical work that we've seen, that adding a managed lane is pretty similar to adding a general purpose lane on a highway in terms of the amount of VMT it would increase. But that's not something we include here in this report. We have another question here. Will our work include reporting recommendations to get to consistency in analysis? That is a great question, and we do not actually include. This was focused on basically how to use the existing empirical evidence, how to operationalize that at a project scale to estimate VMT reductions, and so we didn't actually provide recommendations for future research. I think Chris may have done a little bit more of that in his research. I mean, you ended with that, Chris. I don't know if you actually put that into your memos, but for our portion of it, we focused on recommendations based on the existing research, and we have plenty of recommendations and various other reports about how we could do research better to be more consistent. But that's a very good point in terms of the units of analysis are different, the outcome measures are different. So that's a big difficulty, a challenge that we face in using the research and trying to compare the different studies. And so we do wrestle with that somewhat in our report in terms of how we discuss the studies and synthesize them. And so just from our synthesis, you can probably glean some of the recommendations that we might have for future studies.
Like the
Let's see.
transit one. So yeah, a lot of the studies are sort of system wide. And I think the elasticities, you could apply them at a small scale or a larger scale, but then the trick is figuring out what's the area that will be affected by whatever changes to the system that you're proposing. So yeah, you can do it at the segment or corridor level as well as at a system level, but you've got to think carefully about how you do it.
I think that question, you're talking about the impacts of a system-wide build out of transit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I think it also is one of the challenges in thinking about the impacts of bike and pedestrian investments and a lot of other things is like thinking about, an individual bike lane investment along a corridor as a mitigation measure. Jamey, you can correct me, you'll see pretty small impacts of that individual project. But if it adds up to a low stress network, that's where you really get the VMT reduction. So it's kind of the struggle of what's your scale, and yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and that's something that at least active travel research is starting to get into, but we still don't have a huge amount of empirical evidence about system-wide improvements on the transit side of things. What we can glean some of that by comparing what we see in the US versus what we see in Europe, for example. So there's an induced travel study in Europe that looks at the induced travel elasticity. So you increase roadway capacity by 1% in a major city. How does that affect VMT, or in Europe VKT? And the study that was done, which follows a very similar approach to some of the best studies in the US, shows that you have a lower induced travel elasticity in areas that have built out train systems, basically metro systems. And so what's that showing is basically if you have great transit, even if you're expanding roadways, it probably won't increase VMT to the same extent that we would expect in the US. And so that gives hope for building out a system that is comparable to Europe. We just don't have that in many cases in the US, and so we can't really study it here until we actually do that. I mean, outside of maybe Manhattan, but it's like it's just non-existent in most places in the US. But there is good evidence by comparison looking at Europe that major transit investments can help if you build out an entire system.
And I think all of this points to the problem or the challenge, I should say, that the effects are not necessarily linear, right? So the more of something that you do, you can have more or less effect than when you're doing a little of it. And we just have very, very limited understanding of the ways in which these relationships are nonlinear.
Very good point. And that goes back to the earlier question about recommendations for future research. I think looking at the nonlinear aspects is something we could benefit from kind of across the board on all these measures. I see that Tanvi, a hand raised for a long time. I don't know if you still have a question. Let's see.
VMT monitoring, didn't you have a project on that, Jamey? Mitigation monitoring.
VMT mitigation monitoring. Oh yes, I did. What monitoring protocols are required under yes. Basically, CEQA is effectively an unfunded mandate, and so basically most of the costs get pushed onto developers. So with SB 743 looking at VMT mitigation, yes, theoretically a lot of folks would like to see monitoring. I would love to see monitoring, but there's not really a lot of funding for it. And obviously you want to put a lot of money into having a good CEQA analysis done, good VMT analysis before a project's approved to reduce your chance of getting sued. But once a project's approved, you've dealt with any lawsuits that arise within the statute of limitations there's much lower chance that you're going to get sued if you aren't following the mitigation monitoring protocol outlined in the mitigation monitoring reporting program that you have, which is required by CEQA. And so, yes, there is a plan that is in place for most projects for which a CEQA analysis, or at least a EIR or a mitigated negative declaration, is required in California. But in most cases, the actual monitoring of the effect is kind of a pie in the sky dream. It's a hope. It's not funded, and the most you get in most cases is some evidence that a mitigation measure was implemented, not that it was effective. Basically, you just want to cover your tracks and say, here, we did what we said we were going to do in the EIR and the MND, and but there's the problem really is it comes down to funding. There's just not a lot of funding for monitoring the actual effect, but that would be stupendous if there was more monitoring.
Yes, that's how we learn. So Tanvi?
Oh, they said that hand was up by mistake.
Okay.
Susan, I think a question for you in the chat regarding managed lanes. They say congestion pricing was analyzed, and that is a strategy being used on managed lanes.
Yeah, that's not the kind of congestion pricing we were looking at. We were looking at cordon pricing, like in London, Stockholm, Singapore, and some general road pricing, or some of the studies, for example, in the car brief, look at bridge tolls and what happens as you raise or lower bridge tolls. So not managed lanes. Yeah, as Jamie said, because they're road capacity, so it's a little different than other kinds of pricing strategies.
And getting back to an earlier question too about strategies that could have a huge effect but which are understudied. I mean, we've never really had cordon pricing in the US. I mean,
Yeah.
SF's thought about it. New York almost almost did it after years of saying they would. But we don't, and so we would love to study more of that. There's good examples from Europe, obviously, and Stockholm and London and whatnot, but there still aren't enough of these, especially in the US. It's understudied because it just hasn't been implemented. All right, there is another question that relates to managed lanes, which again, we didn't look at for this project, but yes, we are quite well versed in this, so we can get into it. Would HOT lanes produce more VMT than HOV lanes after the conversion? I mean, theoretically, yes, because you're allowing more people to use the lane. So it's not just people who are carpooling, it is folks who can pay to use the lane as well. So theoretically, you'd expect more people to be using that lane, which opens up even more space on the adjacent general purpose lanes, which evidence has shown tends to backfill pretty quickly. And yeah, the really another problem that with managed lanes is that, and this has been echoed anecdotally by CHP folks, is just there's not enough person power there or enough cameras to catch scofflaws. So there's a ton of scofflaws regardless of the system you're using. And that's obviously been a problem with HOV systems for a long time. So theoretically, you would expect probably a little bit different of a maybe more induced travel if you're including an HOT lane versus an HOV, converting it. But in practice, we've seen in the limited empirical evidence pretty similar effects on VMT. Oh, question.
I accidentally hit answer live to the question about what pricing we're talking about. It's Cordon, Cordon.
And so that's basically you set a cordon, like a line, a circle around like downtown San Francisco, for example, and you say if you're entering that circle, you have to pay. That's what that is, versus you get to use this faster lane if you pay. It's you can't enter this area unless you pay.
Yeah, and that's what was proposed for New York. There's been some talk of all road pricing. MTC did a little thinking about this. I don't know if they still are, but where you would put a toll across the entire highway. Which of course they do on the East Coast, but not so much out here. And yeah, distinction between the type and quality of transit. Yes, almost certainly. Whether the research helps us understand how big a difference that makes is a little less clear. I'm pretty sure that we don't, the studies we reviewed and summarized don't enable that kind of a distinction. Yeah, I guess there's bus versus rail is kind of the best you can do, but not so much BRT.
All right, then there's another question in the Q&A. Are equity impacts of certain types of measures like pricing taken into account? Great question. Not for this study, but in the parallel project that Susan mentioned, where we're updating the policy briefs for the Air Resources Board. This round of policy briefs does include equity impacts of various measures. So those briefs don't cover all of the same measures that we cover here, but there is a lot of overlap, and so once those are published, they do provide some insight into the equity impacts. Very good question.
And then there's also Jesus's project for Caltrans, right, Jamie?
Yes, that's right. And yes,
we have a lot of overlapping projects.
Yes, and so Jesus Barajas and I and some other folks are working on scenario analysis where we're kind of looking at the equity impacts of various VMT mitigation measures for state highway system projects, and kind of coming up with maybe not a recommendation, but some kind of equity metrics that you could use to look at the equity impacts of VMT mitigation measures, at least at a kind of qualitative level, which is something that in CEQA and is not required. I mean, you're not required to look at, it's suggested you look at equity impacts, environmental justice impacts, but so it's not routinely done. And so we're kind of, we're looking at various metrics that could be done, could be used to do that.
And I think the hopeful thing is that many of these measures we're talking about are arguably good things from an equity standpoint. And even in the ones that involve an increase in cost, there are ways to address the equity implications of that. If there are no more questions, anything else there?
Oh, here's one more in the chat. How do infrastructure-related costs impact the long-term sustainability of VMT mitigation programs such as van pools and shuttle services? Say if VMT mitigation measures are funded only for a certain year.
Yeah, that's a good question beyond the scope of our study, but yeah, interesting to think about that. Some of these mitigation measures are programs rather than like a piece of infrastructure that has some permanence. So how do we ensure that the mitigation continues? I think that's what you're asking about. Yeah. Well, maybe we can wrap up, and feel free to reach out to any of us if you have follow-up questions. I don't know if Tyler has a sense of when these reports might be publicly available. Our first review has been pretty thoroughly reviewed. The quantification report is probably a bit longer before it's ready for prime time. Tyler, anything you want to add?
I think both this study and the equity impacts study that Jamey mentioned should be done as soon as they're through peer review on the UC Davis side, and so we're potentially looking at maybe a couple months down the line. And I believe the SB 743 implementation team, the Caltrans Director's Office of Sustainability, will be taking the lead on kind of getting the word out about this stuff. At the very least, it'll be posted and discussed. But there might be additional actions, quite a few areas of potential future research discovered through this type of action. And interestingly, and we talked about during the project, where there's a mitigation measure people are interested in, we found there's no evidence in literature. Another way of thinking about that and building a research program is that might be something that we want to go study. So lots of definitely a future for this type of research, it looks like.
Thank you. There's nothing else. I think we'll thank you all for attending and sign off.